If you've been following the channel for a while, it's good to have you back here on Edgar Cayce Narratives. And if this is your first time, you're in the right place for stories that may feel closer to your own life than you expect. Because what we explore here often doesn't look unusual on the surface, but becomes very personal once you start connecting it to your own experience. Today, I want to start with something very simple, something that doesn't feel dramatic at first. But once you notice it, it becomes very hard to ignore. And it usually appears during a quiet moment when nothing is falling apart and nothing is demanding your attention. But you pause just long enough to look back and begin connecting things that never seemed related before. You think about the relationships you've had, the people who entered your life at different times, each one beginning in its own way, with its own kind of hope, its own expectation, its own belief that this time things would unfold differently. And you remember how real that belief felt in the beginning, how certain you were that this situation would not end like the ones before it. Then your attention shifts to other parts of your life, the work you've done, the paths you chose, the environments you stepped into, each one feeling like a new direction, like you were building something separate from what came before, like you were moving forward instead of repeating anything. On the surface, everything looks different. The people are different. The settings are different. The circumstances are not the same. And there is no obvious reason to connect one situation to another. But when you follow each of those experiences all the way to the end, something starts to feel familiar in a way that is difficult to explain. Because even though the details change, the ending seems to carry the same tone, the same kind of disappointment, the same quiet distance, the same feeling that something didn't work the way you expected it to. And then a thought appears, not loudly, not in a way that demands attention, but clearly enough that you cannot ignore it once it forms, and it stays there long enough to make you uncomfortable. It wasn't the same people, it wasn't the same situation, but somehow, it feels like the same story. And what makes this moment unsettling is not that it happened once, but the realization that this may have been happening again and again, quietly repeating itself across different parts of your life, without you fully seeing it while you were inside it. Before going further, it helps to slow this down and look at what is actually happening here. Because what we are talking about is not a single bad experience or a moment of poor judgment, but something more structured than that. Something that can move through different parts of your life while still keeping the same underlying shape. And if we don't define it clearly, it is very easy to mistake it for coincidence or just bad timing. A pattern, in the context of your life, is not about doing the exact same thing again and again in an obvious way. Because if it were that simple, you would see it immediately and stop it. But most patterns are subtle and they hide behind change. They show up through different people, different environments, and different situations, while still leading you toward a similar emotional result, which is why they are so easy to miss while you are living through them. This is where it becomes important to separate two things that often get confused. Because not everything that repeats is a pattern, and not every difficult outcome means there is something deeper behind it. Sometimes things simply do not work out. Sometimes timing is off. Sometimes people are not compatible. And those situations begin and end without forming a structure that carries into the next experience. A real pattern is different, because it creates a sense of familiarity that goes beyond the surface. And even when the situation looks new, something about it feels known, not in a clear or logical way, but in a quiet internal sense that you have been here before, and that feeling usually only becomes visible when you look back, not when you are in the middle of it. This is why many people do not recognize these patterns while they are happening, because from the inside, each decision feels reasonable. Each step feels like a response to the present moment, and each choice seems independent from the past. so there is no obvious signal that something is repeating. And by the time the outcome appears, it already feels too late to question the path that led there. So the real question is not whether your life contains difficult moments, because that is true for everyone, but whether those moments are connected in a way that forms a structure, something that continues across time even when everything on the surface appears to change. And that leads us to a simple but important question that will guide the rest of this video. If the people are different, if the situations are different, and if the choices feel different, why does the ending feel the same? To make this clearer, it helps to follow one life closely, not as a dramatic story, but as something that feels ordinary enough to recognize. Because patterns rarely appear in extreme situations, they usually unfold in lives that look completely normal from the outside. In the first phase, everything begins in a way that feels right. There is a sense of direction, a sense of commitment, and a quiet confidence that this time things will hold together, whether it is a relationship, a job, or a new environment. The person invests time, energy, and attention into it, not blindly, but with enough trust to believe that the effort will lead somewhere stable. And for a while, it does feel that way. Things move forward, progress seems visible, and there is no clear sign that anything is wrong. But slowly, without a single clear turning point, something begins to shift. Communication becomes less open, expectations become harder to meet, and the space between what was hoped for and what is actually happening starts to widen. Not all at once, but gradually, until the person finds themselves trying to hold something together that no longer responds the way it used to. And eventually, the situation ends, not always with conflict, sometimes just with distance, but always with the same quiet feeling that something didn't unfold the way it should have. After some time passes, a second phase begins. And on the surface, it looks completely different. The people are not the same. The environment has changed. The context feels new. And because of that, the person approaches it with a slightly different mindset, perhaps more careful, perhaps more aware, believing that the previous experience has taught them enough to avoid repeating the same mistake. And this belief feels reasonable. It feels grounded. It feels like growth. And again, for a while, things seem to move in a better direction. There is a sense of improvement, a feeling that this time the outcome might be different. And nothing in the early stages contradicts that belief. But as the situation develops, the same subtle shift begins to appear, not in the exact same form, but with a similar effect. The connection weakens, the alignment fades, and the effort required to maintain the situation begins to increase in a way that feels familiar, even if it is not immediately recognized. What makes this phase more confusing is that the person cannot clearly identify what is repeating, because the details are not the same. The conversations are different, the circumstances are different, and the reasons for the difficulty seem unique to this situation. So it is easy to explain everything as something specific to this moment, rather than something that connects back to the past. And by the time the situation reaches its end, the same emotional outcome appears again: quiet disappointment, a sense of distance, and the feeling that something once again did not hold. Then comes the third phase, and this is where something begins to change. Not necessarily in the outcome at first, but in awareness. Because by this point, there are enough experiences to look back on. And even though each one seemed separate at the time, placing them side by side creates a different picture, one that is harder to ignore. The person begins to notice that while the situations were different, the internal experience was not. The same kind of attachment formed early, the same level of investment was given, the same effort was made to maintain something that was slowly becoming unstable. And most importantly, the same ending kept appearing not as a coincidence, but as something that now feels connected. This realization does not come as a clear answer. It comes as a question that is difficult to avoid, because it challenges something deeper than the situation itself. If these were truly different choices, why do they lead to the same place? And at this point, the pattern is not fully understood yet, but it is no longer invisible. It begins to take shape, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility that something consistent is moving through all of these experiences, something that is not defined by the people involved or the environment, but by the way the person enters, responds, and stays within each situation. What makes this moment important is that the focus starts to shift away from what happened externally and toward what remained consistent internally. Because even though the story changed on the outside, something inside the person followed the same path each time. And that is where the pattern begins to reveal itself. And once that awareness appears, even in a partial form, it becomes very difficult to go back to seeing each experience as completely separate. Because now there is a growing sense that these were not isolated events, but connected parts of a structure that has been repeating quietly across different stages of life. At this point, the most difficult part is not what happened, but what it suggests. Because once a pattern starts to become visible, it creates a conflict that is hard to resolve. And that conflict sits between what the person believes about their choices and what their experiences seem to show. From the inside, every decision felt intentional. Each step felt like a response to a real situation, and nothing about those choices seemed careless or repeated. In fact, the person often believed they were doing things differently, approaching situations with more awareness, more caution, or more effort than before. And that belief was not false. It reflected how the experience felt in the moment. But when the outcomes begin to align in the same way again and again, that belief starts to weaken, not completely, but enough to create doubt. Because if the choices were truly different, if the awareness had increased, then why does the ending still return to the same place? And this is where the tension becomes personal rather than analytical. The question is no longer about what went wrong in a specific situation. It becomes a question about the person's own role within it. Not in a blaming way, but in a way that cannot be avoided once the pattern is seen even partially. Am I actually choosing differently? Or does it only feel that way while I am inside the moment? Is there something in the way I respond, the way I attach, or the way I stay in a situation that remains consistent, even when everything else changes? This is where many people try to resolve the tension quickly, often by pointing to external reasons, different personalities, bad timing, unique circumstances, and while those factors are real, they do not fully explain why the emotional outcome feels so familiar. And that gap between explanation and experience is what keeps the tension active. Because if the explanation were complete, the feeling would not return in the same way. Instead, there is a growing sense that something deeper is involved, something that is not immediately visible, something that shapes the experience from the inside rather than from the outside. And this is where the question begins to shift again, moving away from individual events and toward the structure behind them. If I am not repeating the same situation, then what exactly is repeating? And more importantly, if I cannot clearly see it while I am inside it, how many times has it already happened without me fully recognizing it? This is the point where the pattern stops being just an observation and becomes a problem that needs to be understood. Because without that understanding, the next situation may already be forming in the same way, even if it looks completely different on the surface. To understand what is actually repeating, it helps to stop looking at the surface of each situation and begin looking at the structure underneath it. Because patterns are not defined by events. They are defined by sequences. And once you shift your attention from what happened to how it unfolded, the repetition becomes much easier to see. In most cases, the structure follows a similar path, even when the details change, and it often begins with a familiar internal response. Not something dramatic, but a certain kind of attraction, a certain level of trust, or a specific way of engaging with a situation that feels natural in the moment. And because it feels natural, it does not raise any concern. It feels like the right way to move forward. From there, the pattern continues through a consistent type of investment. The person gives their time, their attention, their effort in a way that mirrors previous experiences, not because they are trying to repeat anything, but because this is how they know how to respond. And this part often feels like commitment, like responsibility, like doing what is necessary to make something work. Then comes a shift. And while it may look different each time, the effect is similar. Something begins to change in the dynamic. The balance becomes uneven. The response from the other side no longer matches the effort being given. And instead of stepping back immediately, the person often responds by increasing their effort, trying to restore what was there before, trying to fix what is no longer stable. This response is important because it is one of the key points where the pattern reinforces itself, not through the situation, but through the reaction to it. And this reaction tends to follow a familiar path, holding on longer than necessary, adjusting more than needed, or trying to maintain something that is already shifting away. And while this may come from a positive intention, it leads toward a predictable outcome. Eventually, the situation reaches its end, sometimes gradually, sometimes more clearly. But the emotional result carries the same tone, a sense of disappointment, a sense of distance, and often a quiet confusion about why things did not hold together despite the effort that was given. When you place these sequences side by side, the repetition becomes clear, not because the situations are identical, but because the internal structure is consistent. The same starting point, the same type of engagement, the same response to instability, and the same ending. This is what makes patterns difficult to detect, because they do not repeat events, they repeat processes. And as long as the focus stays on the surface, each experience will continue to look new, even while the structure underneath remains unchanged. And this leads to a shift in understanding that changes how the entire situation is seen. Because the question is no longer about why different situations lead to similar outcomes. It becomes a question about why the same internal process continues to move through different situations in the same way. Once that shift happens, the pattern is no longer hidden. It becomes something that can be observed, not perfectly, not all at once, but clearly enough to recognize that what has been repeating is not the world around the person, but the way the person moves through it. At this point, there are different ways to interpret what you are seeing, and one of those ways comes from the perspective associated with Edgar Cayce, not as a belief that you have to accept, but as a lens that offers a different way to understand why patterns can feel so persistent, even when you try to change them. From this perspective, what you are experiencing may not be something that began only within this lifetime. And that idea is not presented in a dramatic or mystical way, but as a simple extension of the pattern itself. Because if a structure continues without being fully resolved, it does not disappear on its own. It carries forward until something within it changes. In this view, what we often call a lesson is not an abstract idea or a vague concept. It is something very concrete. It appears as a repeated situation, a repeated dynamic, or a repeated emotional experience that continues to show up until the response to it becomes different. And the repetition is not there to punish. It is there because the structure itself has not been completed. This shifts the focus in an important way, because instead of asking why the same kind of outcome keeps happening, the attention moves toward what has not changed within the process. What part of the response remains the same even when the person believes they are doing something different? And this is where the pattern connects to something deeper than a single decision or a single moment. If the same internal response continues to appear, then the structure will continue as well. Not because the world is forcing it, but because the pattern is being carried through the way the situation is experienced and responded to. And from this perspective, change does not come from finding a completely different situation. It comes from interrupting the structure itself. This is also why the pattern can feel so consistent across different areas of life, because it is not tied to one specific type of situation. It can appear in relationships, in work, in personal decisions, and in many other forms, as long as the internal structure remains active. And this is what makes it seem like life is repeating, even when everything on the surface looks new. At the same time, this perspective does not remove responsibility or control. It actually brings the focus closer to where change is possible, because if the pattern continues through response, then it can also change through response, not instantly, not perfectly, but in a way that gradually shifts the direction of the structure. The important point here is not whether the origin of the pattern comes from past lives or from earlier experiences within this life, because in both cases, the mechanism is similar. Something unresolved continues to express itself through repeated situations, and those situations will keep forming as long as the response remains the same. So instead of seeing repetition as something random or something that simply happens, it can be understood as a continuation, a process that is still in motion, not because it is fixed, but because it has not yet reached a different outcome. And once you look at it this way, the pattern is no longer just something that happens to you. It becomes something you are participating in, often without realizing it, through the way you respond, the way you interpret, and the way you stay within each situation. Once you begin to see how a pattern works in one life, it becomes easier to recognize that it is not limited to a single situation. And more importantly, it is not limited to a single person, because the same type of structure can appear in many different forms, across many different lives, while still following a similar internal sequence. In relationships, this often shows up as a repeated dynamic where the person is drawn to a certain type of connection, not necessarily the same kind of person in an obvious way, but a similar emotional environment, one that feels familiar from the beginning. And that familiarity creates a sense of certainty, a sense that this connection means something, even before it has had time to fully develop. And as the relationship continues, the same pattern unfolds, the same level of investment, the same effort to maintain the connection, and eventually, the same kind of distance or imbalance appears, leading to an ending that feels familiar even if the details are different. In work and career paths, the pattern can take a different shape, but the structure remains similar. The person may enter new roles with a strong sense of commitment, a willingness to give more than what is required, and a belief that effort will lead to stability or recognition. And for a period of time, this seems to work. Progress is visible and the direction feels right. But over time, the same shift occurs. The environment changes, expectations become unclear, or the balance between effort and return begins to break. And once again, the person finds themselves in a situation that ends with the same feeling. Not necessarily failure in a clear sense, but a quiet dissatisfaction that mirrors previous experiences. There are also patterns that are less visible from the outside, but very clear internally, such as emotional cycles that repeat without an obvious external trigger, where a person moves through similar states again and again. Moments of confidence followed by doubt, periods of connection followed by withdrawal, or a recurring sense of uncertainty that appears even when circumstances do not seem to justify it. And these internal patterns often connect directly to the external ones, because they influence how situations are interpreted and how responses are formed. When you place these different examples side by side, the connection becomes clearer, because even though the areas of life are different, the underlying process remains consistent. And this is where the perspective begins to align with ideas from modern psychology, not as a replacement, but as a parallel way of describing the same phenomenon. In psychology, this is often described through behavioral loops, where a person moves through a cycle of perception, response, and outcome that reinforces itself over time. And because the outcome feels familiar, even if it is not desirable, the loop continues to repeat. Not because the person consciously chooses it, but because it has become a learned pattern of interaction with the world. There is also the concept of subconscious attraction, where a person is drawn toward situations that match an internal expectation or familiarity, even when those situations are not ideal. And this attraction does not feel like a choice. It feels like preference, like instinct, which makes it even harder to recognize as part of a repeating structure. Another important idea is identity reinforcement, where the way a person sees themselves begins to align with the outcomes they experience. And over time, this creates a feedback loop. The pattern shapes the identity, and the identity then supports the continuation of the pattern, making it feel stable, even when it leads to results the person does not actually want. What connects all of these perspectives is not the terminology, but the recognition that repetition is not random. It follows a structure that can be observed across different contexts. And whether you describe it as a psychological loop or as a continuation of an unresolved pattern, the effect is the same. Similar processes lead to similar outcomes. And this is where the idea becomes more grounded. Because instead of seeing repetition as something unusual or something that only happens in extreme cases, it becomes something that can be understood as part of how human experience organizes itself over time, especially when certain responses remain consistent. The more you look at it this way, the more it becomes clear that patterns are not limited to one area of life. They move across different areas, adapting to new situations while keeping the same internal structure. And this is why they can continue for so long without being fully recognized. Because each new situation creates the impression of change, even while the process underneath remains the same. At this stage, the most important shift is to understand that repetition is not random, and it is not something that happens without structure. Because what you have seen across these experiences is not a series of unrelated events, but a consistent process that moves through different situations while keeping the same internal sequence. This means the pattern is not defined by the people you meet, the environments you enter, or the circumstances you face. It is defined by how you move through those situations, how you respond at the beginning, how you react when something starts to change, and how you stay or withdraw when the structure begins to break. And as long as that internal process remains the same, the outcome will tend to return to the same place. It is also important to remove two common assumptions that often block understanding, because repetition is not punishment, and it is not something fixed that you cannot influence. It does not exist to hold you in place, and it does not continue because you are meant to experience the same outcome forever. Instead, repetition can be understood as an unfinished process, something that has not yet reached a different result because the response within it has not changed. And this does not require a dramatic shift or a complete transformation. It begins at specific points within the structure, especially at the moments where the pattern usually reinforces itself. Those moments are often subtle. They appear when something begins to shift in a situation, when the balance changes, when the response from the other side no longer matches your effort. And instead of recognizing that shift, and responding differently, the tendency is to continue in the same way, to give more, to adjust more, or to hold on longer. And this is where the pattern continues without being interrupted. So the real point of change is not at the beginning of the situation, and it is not at the end when the outcome is already clear. It is in the middle, at the exact moment where the process starts to repeat itself. Because that is where a different response can alter the direction of the entire structure. This also explains why changing external conditions alone is often not enough, because a new situation can still activate the same internal process. And when that happens, the pattern continues even in a completely different environment, which is why many people feel like they are starting over, while still arriving at the same result. The key idea here is simple, but not always easy to apply. Change does not come from finding a different situation. It comes from recognizing the structure you are in and responding differently within it, even in small ways, because even a slight shift at the right point can begin to change the outcome. And once that shift begins, the pattern no longer needs to continue in the same form, not because it disappears completely, but because it starts to move in a different direction, shaped by a response that is no longer the same as before. At this point, instead of looking at the story as something outside of you, it becomes more useful to turn the attention inward, not in a heavy or uncomfortable way, but in a simple and honest way. Because the value of recognizing a pattern only appears when you begin to see where it may exist in your own life. You do not need to search for something complicated, and you do not need to analyze every detail. It often starts with noticing what feels familiar across different experiences, even when those experiences seem unrelated on the surface. And that familiarity is usually not about the situation itself, but about the way it feels while you are inside it. So a simple place to begin is with a direct question that does not require a perfect answer, but does require attention. What in your life has happened more than once, in different forms, but with a similar ending? It could be a type of relationship that always seems to move in the same direction, a kind of work situation that begins with motivation but ends with the same dissatisfaction, or an internal state that returns even when your circumstances change. And the goal here is not to judge it, but to recognize it. Another question that often brings clarity is this: at what point in those situations did something begin to feel off? And how did you respond when that shift appeared? Because that moment, the one that often gets overlooked, is usually where the pattern continues, not because of the situation itself, but because of the way it is handled. And noticing that moment is often the first step toward changing it. You do not need to solve the pattern all at once, and you do not need to understand everything immediately. But seeing it clearly, even in a partial way, already begins to change your relationship with it. What we have explored here is not a fixed idea or a final conclusion, but a way of looking at your life that may reveal something that was already there, something that did not stand out before because it was spread across different moments, different situations, and different versions of your life. If there is a pattern, it does not mean something is wrong with you, and it does not mean you are stuck. It simply means there is a structure that has been continuing. And once you begin to see it, even in a small way, you are no longer moving through it without awareness. And that alone already changes how the next situation can unfold. If this made you think about something in your own life, or if you started to recognize a pattern that you had not noticed before, feel free to share it in the comments, or share a question that is still unclear, because those details often open the door to deeper understanding. And if you want to explore more stories like this, where everyday experiences are looked at from a different angle, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Edgar Cayce Narratives so you don't miss the next one.